morning. 1 Peter chapter 4 is where we're at. Peter has really been focusing on the example of Jesus Christ. Coincidentally, we're going to be talking about the example of Peter this morning, and what he wants us to find out from his letter here is that really anytime you have a question about how you should behave, the kind of action you should take in pretty much any situation, the question you should ask is, what would Jesus do? And that is really what he wants us to do. In particular, he wants us to look at the example of Jesus as he suffered. So we think from the dating of 1 Peter that it's probably before any of the big persecutions got started, but still there was plenty of hostility towards the Christians, even if it wasn't really overt persecution yet. There was still a lot of Jews and also pagans, Romans, that didn't have a real high opinion of Christians. And so becoming a Christian and trying to behave as a Christian was something that required a little bit of suffering. Maybe not full-scale persecution, but certainly you had to endure some hostility, you had to endure some just general poor attitude on behalf of the people that are around you. And so they had to deal with this. And so Peter wants them to understand, really you're following the example of Christ. Christ already suffered more than you're suffering now. So everything that you're dealing with is perfectly normal. Stick to the example of Jesus and you'll be fine. So chapter 4 and verse 1, Peter says, "Therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lusts, drunkenness, carousals, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. And in all this they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excess of dissipation, and they malign you. But they shall give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit, according to the will of God." Alright, so again in verse 1, Peter repeats this theme that he said a number of times. Christ has suffered, therefore there's something that we're supposed to do. And in this case, he wants us to have the same purpose that Christ had. Because he suffered in the flesh, we are supposed to cease from sin. Of course, Jesus didn't sin himself, but his suffering in the flesh was for our forgiveness. He sacrificed himself. And so we're supposed to be resolved to be done with sin. And I know, and Peter knows, that is a lot easier said than done. But still, that's the goal that we're headed towards here. To live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. So one of the things he's going to set up here is this comparison between the lust of men and the will of God. So as Christians, we have a choice to make, really as people. We have a choice to make, either to follow our own lusts and desires or to follow the will of God. Having become Christian, we've committed that we're going to do this one, we're going to follow the will of God, and Peter's going to tell us how exactly we're supposed to do that. But what it really comes down to is that Christ has suffered for us, and therefore our purpose needs to be that we're done with sin, which of course leads us to we're following the will of God. This is all about orienting our way of living, how we control ourselves, how we order our life. Are we ordering our life just by what we desire to do, what we feel like doing? Are we letting those sort of emotions control ourselves? Are we keeping ourselves self-control? Are we allowing, if we put God first, then all those desires have to come a distant second, and we live a much more self-controlled life. This idea really is not unique to Christianity. If you look through a number of the Greek philosophers, you find them advocating something very similar. Now, they don't put Christ at the top, but they do advocate a self-controlled life. In other words, really separate and apart from being for God, the best way to live your life, even the pagans could come up with this, is a life of self-control, where the body, the lust, the emotions are not in control of you. Peter is taking that same idea, he's coming to the same conclusion that they did, he's elevating it a little bit higher, in that it's not just a life of self-control, it is a life that puts Christ at the top, and therefore is a life of self-control. You're more effective for Christ. You are a better Christian if you live this way than the other way. He says, so live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. And then he goes on, the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles. And then he goes on into this description of what the Gentiles do with their life. Christians were a little bit of a killjoy, really, among their pagan neighbors. Roman entertainment back then, we think pretty badly of our entertainment industry. We talk about the movies, and they've got all this sex and gore and violence in them, which they do. But as bad as our entertainment industry is, the Romans were worse. Really, they were. Their popular entertainment was theater, which would be analogous to our movies. But sex, real sex, on the theater stage was not unusual, even including all sorts of violence on the theater, including some actual deaths in the course of the play.
Camera tricks. I
guess not. Yeah, it's all real. None of this camera stuff. So theater was, there were some good plays. We have some of them today still, but still, a lot of the theater was just morally depraved. Many of the actresses were also prostitutes, so that was kind of mixed in together. It was not really that you could be an actress or a prostitute. It was all kind of the same. If you were an actress, you probably were a prostitute, and if you were a prostitute, you might well be an actress. Chariot races, and I suppose of all the theater or of all the entertainment, this is perhaps least bad. A chariot race is, like any other race, but it involved a lot of gambling, it involved a lot of violence from the fans. We see stories about the soccer fans and how they, get into big fights sometimes. The chariot races were a lot like that. In fact, probably worse than that. So a lot of violence associated with that. The races themselves were fairly violent. Wasn't all that unusual to die while you were in a chariot race. Gladiator fights, of course, most famously. That really was the whole point of a gladiator fight, was somebody was going to die, or some animal was going to die. It was a blood sport, very literally. So that was common entertainment for the Roman world. That's what it was. Christians, of course, being called to behave in this way, disapproved of all of those things. And so compared to what was around them, they were standing up and saying, we shouldn't do this, this is wrong, this is bad, which really makes them stand out. Imagine today if we had a religion, an upstart religion, that's only been around for 10 years or less, and they're going around saying, you know what, we shouldn't be doing 4th of July, we shouldn't be celebrating that, that's just wrong. We shouldn't be doing Thanksgiving, it's wrong to be watching football games. And baseball games are just the work of the devil, and really we need to stop driving too, because that's just wrong. We shouldn't do that sort of thing. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Christianity is doing, taking popular stuff that everybody does and saying this is wrong, this is bad, this is immoral. It would be like somebody arguing those things that we just said. Now we say, what's wrong with 4th of July? What's wrong with driving? What's wrong with football? That's what the Romans would have been saying. What's wrong with the theater? What's wrong with the gladiator shows? You guys are just weird. You're out there. You're crazy to think that way. Now, it's not exactly that comparison, probably a little bit exaggerated. There were pagan philosophers, again, who had that idea of a self-controlled life, saying, the gladiator fights is not really the best way to do it. But still, the Christians were really making themselves stand out by being opposed to that kind of behavior. There.
Well, you still had the Jewish people too, though. I mean, they wouldn't have been engaging in much of this.
Right. That's absolutely true. The Jewish people wouldn't have been engaging with this. The difference is the Jews are an ancient people with an ancient religion. They have been Jews, and they've had that Jewish religion for thousands of years by the time the Romans came along. It's not particularly offensive to the Romans, because the Romans were people who really revered the traditions of the ancients, their own ancients, and so they extended that to other ancient religions. Jews, yeah, you guys are a little bit weird, but you've been doing this for a long time, so that's okay. We'll give you a pass. Christians,
Not so much.
you only just started doing this last year. In fact, I know you. You used to be one of us. You used to be going to the gladiator fights with me. And now you're all being holier than thou. We can't do that anymore. So yes, the Jews would have also been opposed to this. But one, they were that ancient religion, so they could have passed that way. Two, Judaism is not really a religion that tries to proselytize. They don't really go out and evangelize and try to convert people. Mostly, then as now, you're born into Judaism. Christianity has a different focus altogether. Christianity is all about going out and evangelizing and trying to change people. That's going to bring them in for more criticism than Judaism. So, Christians have a problem with their reputation, and Peter is addressing that. Yes, we don't want to do that, but we also need to be aware of how we present ourselves to the pagan world around us. And this sort of thing happens not just back then. It happens whenever Christian values are clashing with the culture around them. That's really what's happening here, is Christian values are way out of step with the culture around them. It happens today too. Whenever you have Christianity in a culture where they clash, you're going to have these kind of problems that the people of Peter's day is having. In fact, this letter was very popular among communist countries 10 or 20 years ago, because so much of we've decided to become Christians, we've kind of become different from the people around us, and we're suffering because of it, just like the people in Peter's day did. Today, if you're a Christian in a Muslim country, whether it's a violent Muslim country like Iran or Iraq, or even the more tolerant ones like Malaysia, you're still way out of step with the culture around you. Same as if you're a Christian in India, someplace like that. Here, not so much. We do have a little bit, we do stand up for some things that our culture doesn't, like we're against abortion and gay rights and that sort of thing. Even so, not nearly so much here as in those countries or back in Peter's day in the Roman Empire. But it's a conflict between the values of the Christians value and the values of the people around you. And the farther apart those two are, the more conflict you're going to have. Peter writes to these guys in verse 3, says, you've already had the opportunity to carry out those desires of the Gentiles. Which is kind of a weird way to put it, because it's very likely that many of the people that he's writing to are Gentiles. Which would suggest that really he's talking to them as though they were Jews. Not Jews as in Jews from Jerusalem or something like that. More that the Jews were the people of God, now Christians are the people of God. So he's really writing to them, you are now the people of God, aka Jews. And in comparison, we have the Gentiles. So even though they may be ethnically Gentiles, they have separated themselves from that Gentile world. And so he can talk to them as though they were Jews. He lists off all sorts of these destructive behaviors that the Gentiles are engaging in. We've got sensuality. We've got various kinds of lusts, drunkenness, carousals, You've got drinking parties. And not just idolatries, but abominable idolatries. That last one is particularly key because things like this are bad. Pretty much anybody with any sort of moral fiber to them can see why too much sex, too much drunkenness, too much parties is all about lust and indulging yourself and not having any self-control. These are things that people with a smidgen of morality could see, yeah, that's good. We ought not do that sort of thing. This one, though, really sets Christianity and Judaism apart. Most religions, in fact, pretty much all of them, except for Christianity and Judaism, argued that theirs was the best way to go, but they didn't condemn all the rest of them. You might be a follower of Zeus, or of Mithras, or of Zoroaster, but your attitude wasn't, I'm right and all these others are wrong. All these other ones are fake. It was more in the sense of, you've got your God and I've got my God. And you do your thing and I'll do my thing. There was no particular conflict between I'm following this way, this God, and you're following that God. But Christians came along and they didn't argue that. It would have been okay if they had said, we ought to follow Christ. The Romans would have said, okay, fine, you follow Christ and I'll follow Zeus. We'll all be fine. But Christians don't say that. They say, I'm going to follow Christ because he's the one true God. All the rest of them are idols, fake. They're just nothing. In fact, they're worse than nothing. They're pretend gods. That's very offensive to someone who believes that there are lots and lots of gods out there. I've believed this all my life. My father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and as many grandfathers back as I know of have followed these idols. And you're saying they are nothing. Absolutely nothing. So when Peter adds this end to this list, again, what Peter is arguing here is similar to what the great pagan philosophers argued, but it's elevated to a higher level than what they argued. So he adds in a bunch of good stuff here, but then he adds this abominable. He doesn't describe as idolatries. They're abominable idolatries. Really bad, nasty, not worth any sort of attention whatsoever. And so, how do the Gentiles react? All this, verse 4, they are surprised that you don't run in with them, and they malign you. They react badly to this sort of behavior on the part of the Christians. But Peter says, don't worry about them. They're going to give an account. 2, he says, verse 5, they're going to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So we've got people who made the choice, one of those things. Whichever choice they make, they're going to be judged by God. And it's interesting the way that he puts it, though. He doesn't say you're going to be judged by God. He describes God as the one who will judge the living and the dead. I don't think this verse has a whole lot to do with questions of do people who are dead have the chance to repent again and be forgiven in that sense. I think just in this context here, what Peter is trying to talk about has more to do with everybody is judged by God. Whether you're alive or dead, you're going to be judged by God. So it's not a question of what happens so much after death. The real key is the judgment. Whichever one of those two routes that you chose, whether you chose to be self-controlled or chose not to be self-controlled, you're going to be judged. Whether you're alive or dead, you're going to be judged by God. So Christians, don't worry about how these pagans are treating you. This is a little bit different teaching out of Christianity than most other religions of the time were teaching. Most of them didn't teach that there was accountability after death. They didn't really teach a judgment. There was some idea of you're going to get your just desserts, but really it was more like if you were really bad, you got punished, or if you were really good, you went to some really good place. For the vast majority, the afterlife was just sort of this gray place that was neither really good nor really bad. So there wasn't a whole lot of teaching that there was strict accountability, that you were going to be judged on the basis of what you did. Peter says, whoever you are, if you're living, if you're dead, if you're a Roman, if you're Jewish, if you're Christian, whatever culture you're from, you're going to be judged. Which, of course, suggests, well, we really do need to choose one of these two ways. We need to choose how we're going to live, but also gives some reassurance to these Christians that one of the questions that they struggled with was, what happens if we are a Christian and then we die? Jesus hasn't come back yet. So are those people that have died, are they still saved? You know, we can laugh at that because we've already solved that problem. We know that they are. But we know that they are because they had the question back then, and Peter answers it here, that God's going to judge them just like He's going to judge us. And so, yes, death is no loss of salvation. It's going to be there regardless. Okay. Verse 7, he changes the subject a little bit. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be of sound judgment and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. As each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Whoever speaks, let him speak as it were the utterances of God. Whoever serves, let him do so as by the strength which God supplies, so that all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. One of the reasons why we got into 1 Peter was we wanted to ask the question, how should a Christian behave? Become a Christian, what do we do now? How do we behave differently now that we're a Christian? What does God expect out of us? And Peter gives us a lot of practical advice. I made this point a lot about James, that when you get into Paul's letters, sometimes it's easy to get lost in the theology that he's developing. He starts off with some point, and then he takes 12 chapters to go through all his arguments and counter-arguments, and sometimes you get lost. James and Peter really don't do that. They hit points of theology, they'll spend 3 or 4 verses on it, and then they move on to the next point. And they mostly want to focus on how should a Christian behave. And so he gives us some of that right here. And this is all tied to the judgment of God. Since God's going to judge us, how should we behave? What kind of behavior should we have? He says that the end of all things is at hand. Probably not the end of the world. It could be, and that would be included in that. But considering the whole context of what he's been talking about here, it's probably more that he's thinking that the end of God's plan. God's been developing this plan of salvation for a very long time. Now that Jesus has come, now that he's died, now that people, including Gentiles, are being called, we've reached the end of God's plan. So not so much the end of the world, but the end of God's plan. We're in that last part of it. And therefore, again, we come back to, now since we're in this last time, how should we behave? And he tells us, verse 7, be of sound judgment, sober spirit, particularly wants them to love one another fervently, very strongly. He wants them to be hospitable. And he wants them to serve each other. So sound judgment. You'll notice that this is in contrast to that list we had up earlier. All those things that the Gentiles were doing, this is about as far away from that sort of behavior as you can get. So basically, he's provided this contrast to us. On the one hand, you can allow your lusts to control you. Everything that you do is just to make yourself happy for the moment. Or you can choose this kind of behavior, which is a completely different sort of behavior. It's all about your self-control. Sound judgment, obviously this is not someone who's drunk or who's just running off whatever he thinks of at the moment. This is someone who can think about things thoughtfully, carefully, and all that sort of thing. Sober spirit for prayer. It obviously tied back here to this sound judgment, but here he says it's for the purpose of prayer. It's specifically for prayer. Prayer is something that Christians struggle with because it's something that you do and yet you don't personally accomplish anything. I mean, if I spend time studying for a class and I teach it, I've accomplished something. But if I spend time in prayer, what did I actually do? It's a little bit harder, I think, for us to grasp, or at least it is for me. But I think what he's calling us here is that in prayer, we call on God, we submit to God, we recognize His plan. Remember Peter just said that we're in the last time, or the end of all things. We recognize that. We gain some wisdom and some guidance from God in our prayer, particularly when we deal with these outside cultures. We've got this vast culture outside of us, Peter's readers do, that is trying to pull them away from Christ, trying to pull them into all sorts of wrong stuff. And we do too. Maybe not quite as strong as they did, but we have that same outside culture that doesn't want us to do these things. When we soberly come before God and discuss all these questions and problems with Him, we gain a lot of strength, guidance, and strength for dealing with all that sort of thing. Verse 8, above all, keep fervent in your love for one another. So more important even than prayer, keep fervent in your love for one another. So he sets this very, very strong. But it's more important than everything else, and he describes it as fervent love. This implies, fervent implies an intent that you are steadfastly pursuing. That you are just focused so hard on it that regardless of what difficulties come along, you're going to keep on following that purpose. And so this is love despite the problems, despite the difficulties. It's another way of saying agape love, really. This is something that you are going to keep on loving, even when there's all sorts of reasons not to. He tells us that love covers a multitude of sins. So as you might imagine, people get a little confused about this. Does that mean that if I love somebody that I get forgiven of sins? No, I don't think it's that. I think, again, we're talking about relationships between Christians here. This is a community of churches, a community of Christians, typically very small churches that Peter is writing to. These are communities that are setting themselves apart from the community around them. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, that for many of these Christians, to become a Christian meant they had to alienate themselves from their families. Either their families don't want them to have anything to do with them anymore, or just being Christian and having these different values separates them from their families. So in other words, before they became a Christian, they had their family, they had their friends, they had these communities that supported them. Now they become a Christian and they had to separate themselves from those. So they need to replace it. Yeah.
That happens even today. I mean,
Yeah.
within the so-called umbrella of Christianity, because you talk to people that have been brought up in Catholic Church, or people that have been brought up as Baptist or Methodist or whatever.
Right.
And when they, come to realization, they decide that they're going to follow Christ and they're going to become part of the Church of Christ. That's one of the things you hear as a reason a lot of times. Well, my whole family's going to alienate me. They can't do that, because
Right.
they're in the same situation, especially when it's a conversion from Catholicism to what I would call Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
That's because those bonds run so deep, and when you get into certain communities, especially like in Hispanic communities and stuff
Yep.
like that, it's really difficult to try to overcome that because their families definitely, don't agree with them leaving the church.
Right. Right.
And so there's still that happening even today, let alone if you're talking a Muslim person converting or even a Jewish person,
Yep.
person converting today,
Right.
there's still that strong alienation that takes place.
Right. Right. Very much so happens today. Catholics, Jews, Muslims, someone from that sort of community is going to have that problem of alienation. So coming here to 1 Peter would be a good place to send those people. That was a problem that they dealt with back then. So what you have is being cut off from what they used to have, those support networks. They need to replace it. And that's what the church is supposed to be. All of us are coming together. All of us have been alienated from what we used to have. We need to replace that community with our church. But, as all of you know, whenever you get a group of people together, sooner or later, they're going to start fighting about stuff. There's going to be disagreements. You're going to think we should go this way, I'm going to think we need to go that way. We're going to crash into each other. And Peter, thankfully, is perfectly aware of church fights. He knows how they work. And because he knows how people work. Church fights are not about churches, and they're not really about Christians. They're about people. People and our human natures and the way that they crash into each other. Whether you're any group like that, whether you're a Boy Scout or a Christian or an anarchist, any of those groups are going to have fights among themselves. And so Peter wants to address that problem. And the way he addresses it, if all of us, every single one of you Christians that are in this little community, have this attitude of fervent love for one another, you're going to cover a multitude of sins. Not my sins against God, necessarily, but my sins against you and your sins against me. If I come into this with an attitude, I am going to love Daryl no matter what, then it's okay if Daryl offends me. I can choose not to be offended. I can choose not to get mad at Daryl because of what he did. Now maybe he was wrong, maybe he wasn't. That's between him and God. But I can choose how I respond. And if I have this attitude, then I'm going to say, yeah, that really bothered me, but I'm going to go on anyway. I'm not going to leave the church in a huff. It was a bigger problem back then, really. And today, if we decide that we don't like that church anymore, we can leave and go to another church down the road. There's some other church near enough that we can pack up and go. Back then they couldn't. There was one church in the whole city. And that church might only have 12 people in it, but that's it. So we either learn to get along with each other, or if that church implodes because of dissension among its members, most of those people are just going to drift away and get lost and not remain Christians. So it was incredibly important back then. It's still important today, but really, really important back then because they didn't have anywhere else to go. And speaking of going places, he adds on this idea of hospitality. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. Could mean anything from overnight hosting of traveling Christians. I think we talked about this before, that they didn't have hotels. There were lodging houses, but generally they weren't real safe. So typically, if you're traveling, if you could find some friends or some community that you had an association with, like Christians, if you could find people like that, you could stay with them overnight. That was going to be a lot safer for you. Could be everything from that to, like I said, a lot of these churches are really small. They didn't have a meeting house necessarily, so they might have been meeting in homes. We know from several Paul's letters that churches did meet in homes. So those people have to open up their homes, which could be a little dangerous if you're in one of those situations where the people around you are hostile to you. By opening up your home, it becomes apparent, your neighbors can see all these other people coming. It becomes apparent that something's going on in your house, and it might become clear that you're a Christian. So you might be actually opening yourself up to a little extra danger. And then verse 10, as each one has received a spiritual gift, employ it in serving each other. As good stewards, this is the same word that Paul uses over in 1 Corinthians, that the gifts, that is the same word that he uses there. He talks specifically about miraculous gifts, Paul does, in 1 Corinthians. Peter doesn't identify these as miraculous gifts, but that would be included. So all Christians, he says, you've got some gift. Some of them are miraculous, some of them maybe not, but all of you have got some kind of gift. Some kind of a gift, and he says, you use it for the betterment of Christ, for the betterment of each other, as good stewards of the grace that God has given to us, which is exactly the same point that Paul made to those Corinthians, that in the way that you use them, you make sure that they're being used for the betterment of people around you. Paul specifically mentions over in chapter 14 that if you've got the gift of tongues, but nobody can interpret, don't speak out. Not because you're suppressing your gift or something like that, but simply because it's not helpful. If nobody else can understand you, then your gift, great as it may be, is not being of service to the Christians around you. That's why he wants that person to not speak up. So the whole point of a gift is not, yay, I've got a gift. The whole point of your gift is use that, find some way to use that gift to the benefit of the Christians around you. And that is a principle that is absolutely not restricted to miraculous gifts. All of us have some sort of talent, some sort of skill that we can use for the church. Find your skill, find a way that you can use it for the betterment of your church, and do it. That's what Peter calls us to do. Find your gift and use it for each other. Verse 11, whoever speaks, let him speak as it were the utterances of God. Whoever serves, let him do so as by the strength which God supplies, so that all things God may be glorified. What's the goal of all this? Glorifying God. Not about me, not about you, not about whether I'm right or you're right. It's about glorifying God. If we can keep that kind of focus on us, then the church that Peter's writing to, the church that we have today, are going to be strong places that can replace that community that people lost when they left the world and moved into the church.